Hello, bookworms! Welcome! Today we are joined by author Elaine Castillo and Don Jaucian, features director of CNN Philippines. This discussion will revolve around the topic of reading critically. A small group of writing and literature students have also been invited to join this pre recorded talk, so we're hoping to hear their questions and reactions at the end of this event. Elaine Castillo was named one of 30 of the planet's most exciting young people by the Financial Times and was born and raised in the Bay Area. Her debut novel, America Is Not the Heart, was a finalist for numerous prizes, including the El Big Book Award, the Center for Fiction Prize, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize. It was named a Best Book of 2018 by NPR, Real Simple, LitHub, the Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Post, Kirkus Reviews, and the New York Public Library. Her latest book, How to Read Now, is a collection of essays that was released this year. Our host, Don Jaucian, is the features director of CNN Philippines. His work has also been published in CNN Style, La Oficial Manila, and the Manila Review. He has interviewed many authors throughout his career as a journalist, such as our very own Elaine Castillo, Hanya Yanagihara, Randy Ribay, Albert Samaha, Benjamin Alirezines, and Adam Johnson. Let's welcome the stellar Elaine and Don.
Hi.
Yay.
Hello.
Hello, thank you so
while.
much. Oh my gosh, it's been too long. It's been too
I
long.
know.
Hello, cheers,
Um,
cheers, tandoy to you.
Cheers with my water. So I guess just little bit of catching up. How have you been doing since promoting your first book, your debut novel?
Oh well, the time since then has been completely normal and not at all dystopian. So I just been a kind of normal time, totally uneventful. No, I'm kidding, obviously. But I missed you guys very, very much. I was just saying how much I wish I was just drinking this with you guys in Manila somewhere.
Yeah, I know. It would have been great to have you here and discuss your new book with you um, in person, but maybe next year,
Next
the
year, let's
next time.
try.
Okay, so we're here to discuss your new book, How to Read Now. Yay, which is I love so much. I think I am on my third reread. I
Oh my
read this
gosh,
for
Don.
yeah. I read this last night. I think bits of it, like several essays, just for this interview, and maybe I'll do one another if I have when I'm going to write it. I write about it. Um, so in your intro, which I love the title of the intro, which is your author's note or a Virgo class clarifies things. Is the title your idea?
Yeah, no, you're asking a Virgo if something was her idea. Anytime a Virgo has the opportunity to clarify herself or harangue somebody, she'll take it. Yeah, that was my idea. That was my idea. I think originally it was because the How to Read Now essay, because I'd started writing the book before the pandemic. I started writing it in 2019, spring of 2019, and then I left it for a while because I was on tour. I was working on a novel, and then when I came back to it, we were in the pandemic. It was fully, and a lot of things I'd gone through a lot of medical issues as well. So I was coming back to it completely different. And then when I started writing that essay, the How to Read Now essay became very disjuncted because it was so obvious that half of it basically was written prior to the before, in the before times, and then the other
You
half
see.
was talking about 2020 and the George Floyd protests and everything, and they weren't going together. So it just seemed clearer, or I mean, literally, it seemed better to clarify or to create an author's note that was coming from that specific time, from the kind of post 2020 world.
Okay. But just to maybe put the talk into context, because people are coming here maybe expecting to hear like an intro to your book a little bit more. You said in the intro that these essays about critical reading or reading in general are mainly anchored in the context of the American reading public. But as you're talking to Filipinos right now, what kind of reading, public reading, do you want to address for like maybe international readers? How do you want to address them with this book?
Well, I mean, I think saying right off the bat that so much of the context is rooted in an American context and especially even a Californian context, I think is also
Yeah,
just to make sure that I'm not talking for anybody. I mean, people in the diaspora cannot talk for people who live in the Philippines and etc. I mean, that's a very that's obvious. But I think there's also, you know, so much of the book also because I started writing it, for example, I started writing it in New Zealand. I was on book tour and it was spring of 2019. I was at the Auckland Writers Festival and I started writing it there. I had kind of a very sort of epiphanic, sort of life altering trip there, which I felt very anxious and embarrassed about at the time because I was like, oh God, I'm on my eat, pray, love journey. What is happening to me? And I'm like, I don't want to be a neo-colonial talking about, but you know, but I think because of that, you know, travel writing is a very fraught genre. It's, you know, it has mostly it's, you know, white people talking about, well, the Philippines, for example, being like, look how exotic everything is, look how nice the people, you know,
exactly.
that genre. So I was very aware of that. But I think the way that I think, or the way, especially the way this book allowed me to think, was naturally international because, you know, in writing about some place like New Zealand or my experiences in New Zealand, in some way, I would hope that I'm writing more in the tradition of the travel writing of someone like James Baldwin, who wrote beautifully about France, about Switzerland, about places not like home, places that weren't home in ways that illuminated home, while also illuminating his own experience, you know, particularly as a Black American in places like France and Switzerland. So I think that, you know, the way that I think does tend to be international. I mean, I think that's probably also because my father gave me so many books in translation, so it was very natural for me to read in translation and not necessarily think, oh, if anything, I think when I was younger, I read more in translation than I read American literature. I came to American and English language literature, I think, quite late. Like I came to classics like Jane Austen and George Eliot. I was already kind of an adult. I think I was in my 30s when I first read George Eliot. So I think that the international aspect of how I read or how I think about the world. I mean, even with films, you know, I grew up, I mean, I watched so many Asian films, probably because there was a dearth of Asian American films. So I was looking for, you know, I grew up, I was watching Wong Kar-wai, I was watching Don Jaucian, I was watching Park Chan-wook. So I think that that's always been a part of my omnivorousness as a reader, as a critical thinker.
So also in the your clarification, you wanted to you said that the title "How to Read Now" is an easier or a sexier title than something like "How to Dismantle Your Entire Critical Apparatus," which is basically the premise of the book, questioning the way we read, whether it's something like Jane Austen or even a sign that you saw when you were traveling in New Zealand. So, what was the impulse to address something that has been um, brought up by many authors, mainly white authors, and so what brought you to writing this book?
I mean, the elevator pitch I've been giving is that if I didn't write this book, I probably would have just had to leave the industry. I don't think I would have continued, just because I think that it was starting to become alarmingly clear, glaringly clear that the work of writers of color was being instrumentalized in ways that the work of white writers just simply wasn't. But I mean, going back to your point about How to Read Now being a sexier title than How to Dismantle Your Entire Critical Apparatus, which is that's the real title of the book, really.
Yeah.
Because, you know, so much of the book, and I think the reason for that, or the reason for the omnivorousness, I think, of the book's perspective, or the things that the book is taking on, is also because I don't myself come from a family of readers. I had one person who was a huge reader in my life. It was my father. the fact that he was a reader was very much class inflected. I mean, he was a security guard by the time I was born, and my mom was a nurse. So on paper, it was a very working class family. But in his whole previous life in the Philippines, because he was 54 when I was born, he was an orthopedic surgeon. He was upper middle class. He had a facility with books and with reading and with literacy that my mom just didn't have and still doesn't have. So I think because of that, because I didn't have anyone else that I talked to with books in my family. I didn't even have anyone else that I talked to with books with my friend group. I mean, I think most of the time I pretended I wasn't a reader, but everyone around me would watch X-Men. Everyone around me was watching, so I think because of that, I wanted to include people who themselves maybe feel intimidated going into an independent bookstore or picking up Jane Austen, who don't feel like the literary world, because it can be an elitist and gatekeeping world, who don't feel the literary world is for them. But at the same time, I don't want to let off the hook the people in my life who are like, oh, well, I'm not a reader. I don't. Well, it's like, well, you watch X-Men. I mean, you watch Watchmen. So you are critically engaging in the world and what you consume and how you talk about it, and how you talk about Star Wars and all of that. So I think that's the impetus behind wanting to think about reading in this larger way.
So it was really conscious, like a conscious decision for you to include not just books when you're talking about when your book is titled How to Read Now, and then maybe readers would be surprised to find, oh, she's talking about Watchmen, the HBO limited series. Oh, she's talking about Walker Y. She's talking about X-Men. So how would you address something like that? Maybe when readers are coming into the book.
Well, I think it's like I say in the book. For me, reading is not the practice that brings us to books, which is to say that's not the trajectory that most interests me. That reading brings us to books. That reading brings us to fetishize books as an object or as an ideal. I think books can bring us to reading, which is to say being a reader in the world and having books in my life allowed me to become someone who engaged with the world, who looked at films a specific way, who looked at TV shows and X-Men a specific way, who looked at history a specific way or read placards a specific way, because all of these things are engaging. All of these things are telling stories. All of these things are telling, anything from civic monuments to the way signage works in a national park. All of these things are trying to tell us stories about how whoever put that statue in place, whoever put that signage in place, they're telling us how to read that specific site. So I think for us, it's only natural that we should then read those things.
So of course, when we talk about reading, we have to ask you about your journey as a reader. So what were your formative moments as a reader? And of course, you mentioned in your book earlier that your dad was really the one who gave you your first books and set you off in your journey. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there would be no way for me to write about my childhood, but especially about my reading life without writing about him, because it all came from him. It was all a gift from him. I mean, we were going to the Goodwill, which is like the charity store, or the local library. I can't even remember how young I was, very young. I mean, in my family mythos, I mean, if you believe my mom, I was reading in the womb. So I don't know. I mean, my mom, the joke in my family is that nobody saw my face until I was about maybe 10 or 12, just because, I would be eating and then there would be a book here and you just wouldn't know what I looked. They'd be like, we didn't know what you looked like until you were like 12 or 13. So that was always huge in my life. But I mean, as I said before, the class aspect was always there because I was aware that it was something that was coming from him and his background and his in a way that I think also did sometimes make my mom feel not excluded, but like it was a world that was untouchable to her for a long time. So that I think that it's never been this wholly altruistic or wholly benevolent place, even though for me, obviously, reading was the lifeblood of my entire existence. But I think what was also great about that, the fact that it came from someone who my father was, he never had he didn't have an English degree or anything. He didn't have a academic love of books. So he didn't teach me things like, oh, this is Jane Austen, learn about, this century of literature, or read James Joyce for modernism, or Virginia Woolf or anything. It was just like, read this book, read that book, read this. And it was all mixed together. Time periods were mixed together. Genres were mixed together. There was no oh, read fiction, but don't read, you would read, it would be read a fiction book and then read a philosophy book and then read a book on world religions or Babysitter's Club. And it was all very just mixed. It was just, it was the very proverbial bookworm. You were just eating through pages. And I'm grateful for that, because it was just it's such a personal way of reading. It's such a idiosyncratic way of reading. And it didn't give me any gatekeeping around what constitutes good highbrow literature and what doesn't. He liked, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, but he also liked really trashy paperback sci-fi about, I think there was one about telepathic Vikings at some point. So that was one of his favorites. So I think, that it was a really democratic way of reading ultimately.
Telepathic Viking sounds like a pitch for a Netflix show. Do you remember your early favorite books that you still want to remember now?
Oh, earliest probably. I think my dad gave me a copy of Edith Hamilton's Greek Myths. I think it was just a compilation book of Greek myths, and that started me off on a lifetime. Really, almost decade. It's still in me now, but it did turn me into a classicist, and I really did think I was going to be like the Pinay and Carson. I thought, okay, Autobiography of Red, Beauty of the Husband, Eros the Bittersweet, let's go. And then later, I thought, well, there's one Anne Carson, and that's fine. But I did, for a long time, I thought I was going to be a classicist. I started college doing ancient Greek and Latin and translating Herodotus. So all of that is still that was very big in my life. And I still do like ancient and medieval literature. I like the roots of words and the roots of things. And that's probably very clear from the book.
What kind of phases did you have as a reader? We all had a sci-fi phase. We all had a all classics phase. So
yeah,
do you remember this phases that you had to go through?
Oh yeah, I don't even consider them phases that I go through. I'm in all of those phases still.
Until now.
What's that Friends episode when Joey just keeps putting on sweaters? That's what I feel like. I put on the classicist sweater, and then sci-fi fantasy. I put the sci-fi fantasy sweater. I was a big Star Trek Next Generation person growing up. I still am. I remember I saw Patrick Stewart in a play once in London, and I almost fainted. I think he and Tony Leung and Maggie Chung are probably the only celebrities where I would give I think I actually faint.
Maybe take a selfie with.
Oh God, I can't. I would never be able to. But Patrick Stewart loomed very big in my childhood, and Star Trek, and you could play the opening of Star Trek Next Generation, and it's literally the level of calm that goes through me. It's a real sense of, oh, everything's gonna be okay. I'm safe here. So there's that sci-fi fantasy that was very big in my life. Obviously, big anime and manga. They talked about this before. Obviously, big Sailor Moon person, big Fushigi Yugi, all the 90s animes. And that's still, I was watching some Boruto recently, so it's still in my life. And then a lot of, I did go through a lot. I did read a lot of work in translation, and I think that was maybe the biggest in terms of literary phase. That was the biggest one. I think because I liked reading books that, maybe I liked reading books that no one else was reading, but I did like reading German and Austrian authors. Austrian authors like, Thomas Bernhard and Elfriede Jelinek and Peter Handke, who I criticize in the book, and Japanese authors and Latin American authors. I think I was in that phase or in that reading for such a long time that I think in my 30s when I finally sort of discovered George Eliot, or even recently, I recently read Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence, and I was just texting people. I was like, "This is so good." My friends were like, "Where have you been?" I was just sending them pictures of Xena, like she looks like Countess Olenska. Stop it.
Yeah. For those who are like very interested in the book, there's an essay there where Elaine discusses Peter Handke and the very problematic ways of reading him. So I hope you pick up the book. Okay. So jumping off from that, was there a specific moment that you felt radicalized about reading a certain book? That really changed the way you read books that are considered very dead white man's canon, and that
Yeah,
made you set off into your journey.
I don't know if there's one moment where that made me feel radicalized. I think it was more, and I don't know that I even do feel radicalized because there's some, in some way, I don't accept that reading Jane Austen with all the historical context that goes with her is a radical reading. To me, it's politically radical to suggest that we should read her and that we can read her without it. That's a very,
Mhm.
that to me is very politically radical. It's just not my side of politics, but it is, that requires a feat of willful misreading and requires a feat
Mhm.
of willful historical amnesia that, I mean, it's quite a, it's quite impressive. So I think for me, I don't think there's a single book or a single moment that, you know, impressed to me the importance of reading critically. I think like most of us, our life teaches us how to read, and we read according to the lives that we've been living, and because for me it wasn't a choice to read these things that way. If anything, I think it says something politically that people can opt out or think they can opt out of politics, the way that the my critique of Peter Handke kind of takes as a jumping off point an article about him winning the Nobel Prize, and this New York Times article that's defending his win of the Nobel Prize by going, well, you know, I'm reading him non-politically, as if
Mhm.
as if politics is a thing that one can choose. And I mean, conspicuously, it is a thing that some people can elect to choose. It doesn't mean that it doesn't choose them.
I think that really reflects the privilege of the people who can just opt out of politics when reading something, especially something like Hanka, who um, denies war crimes. Um, okay. So how did it feel writing the book, writing these essays, and then in the US, books are starting to get banned in multitudes.
Oh, I mean, it's true for any writer. I think if you to be and living through once again. I mean, it's not like this is new to my generation. I mean, the harrowing thing is that generations of writers before me had to fight this as well. But to live through, the not just book banning, but the fervor around, God forbid, teaching critical race theory in schools, or the the promotion of white replacement theory, all of these things, I mean, obviously contribute to a poisoning of our, not just our reading culture, but our intellectual, our ethical, our moral culture. So obviously it's something I take with absolute, I'm absolutely fine with it, Don. I don't know.
So I was reading a little bit of reviews of your book last night, maybe just to get something for the interview, and also just maybe stopping myself from reading everything, um, because it could influence the way I would um, make the questions. Which also I had to stop watching your interview with Gina because when
Oh
she
gosh,
started reading, talking about like the Marxist theory, it's
I
like,
love
oh my
her.
god, it's gonna influence the way I'm gonna interview Elaine. Um, but yeah, one of the things that gets quoted. I think it's starting to like people are starting to quote this online. Is the line "White supremacy makes for terrible readers," and I think it's gonna be either be celebrated. People are gonna make Instagram slides about it. They're gonna put it on their Twitter, or it's either that or it's going to be taken out of context and described as a symptom of liberal woke media. You know how people are attacking anything that is out of their worldview. So how do you want to address that now that the book is out in the wild?
I mean, it's true. I mean, in a just a basic, in a basic truth sense, in a basic moral sense, I stand behind the line. I mean, obviously, the line, it's the opening to an essay, and it is obviously said tongue in cheek. I mean, it's a kind of bombastic opening to a line. I mean, a lot of the book, the tone of the book is one that is very much one of veering between biting humor and gentler humor, but then right back to biting humor. I think that tone was very important to me. And that line to me, I mean, I hear it the way I think of it, which is kind of like, someone just walking and telling a joke. So white supremacy makes for terrible readers, huh? That kind of tone. So I think, taken out of context, yeah, I think even, in any context, I stand behind it. But I mean, that just comes with the territory of publishing a book and the things that people will latch onto. I mean, I've noticed that people are latching onto obviously the first essays of the book, which are much more polemic about the publishing industry, because I think that is an easier, well, not easier, but I think it's a more palatable isn't quite the right word either. But I mean, it's a more discussable. Those are more discussable in a sense essays, as opposed to the later essays, which I think they still do very close reading, and they are still still polemic and intentionally polemic. Especially, for example, the essay on Joan Didion, but the essay on John Berger or the essay on Asian film. Those are essays that take I wouldn't say a gentler tone, but a quieter, maybe a more introspective tone. And those kinds of ebbs and flows, or that kind of emotional cadence of the book, was really important for me as well. So you can start with a big bombastic line about this, but then also, get into moments of public vulnerability.
So coming from, I mean, living in the age of bookstagram and book talk or literature talk, how do you think someone can set up on their journey of critical reading?
I mean, I think, I think so much of this book is personal, or at least goes into my personal history of how I came to books in a way, because I think the best answer to that is to be an example, or to provide one example of how a person became a reader, because there's no 1, 2, 3 here, read this, read that, or every single book you ever read, every single TV show you ever watch, read every historical book that's been written about that time period, or read every Austen. That's just not realistic. That's not and that's just not, there's only so much time in the day until whatever meteor comes to hit us and put us all out of our misery. But I think understanding that your life also teaches you to be the reader that you are. I mean, for good and for ill. I mean, if you grow up never having to understand yourself as a political being, never having to understand your body as political matter, that's probably how you will approach the books that you encounter. But if you do start to think of yourself contextualized that way, I think it's not just reading that gets opened up for you. It's an entire world. I mean, critical apparatus. So I think ultimately it's not about giving a set of instructions, but understanding how much your life really leads you to being the kind of reader that you are.
What are do you think there are tools that can help you to read critically, or I mean, especially that we have students in the audience? Do you think there are like some things that they have to be mindful of when they read?
Sure. I mean, I think, the advice I used to give to aspiring writers, now I think I give the opposite advice, which is, before I used to give, read a lot, read and read and read, and write slowly, take your time. And now I think I give the opposite advice, which it's an advice I'm giving to myself also, which is to read more slowly. Not necessarily to read less, although I think practically that is what will happen if you read slowly. That's just how time, that's just physics. But I find myself trying to teach myself to read slowly, just because I think we are, the attention economy is such that there's always a hot new book. And I'm saying this as someone who has a new book out, so I realize this is a critical. But there's another book, there's another TV show, there's another this, or that we're being tasked to pay attention to, and there's no way we can develop intimacy or develop real vulnerable relationships if we're having to do it at this breakneck pace. For me at least, maybe this is just an earth sign thing, that you need that time. I mean, I find I'm always behind. Like, I just started watching The Americans. This is the same thing with Age of Innocence. I just started watching The Americans, and I was like, this show is amazing. My friends were like, again, where have you been? So I think reading slowly and reading weirdly, I think if everything around you says read this, and that includes my book. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing to read things that no one else is reading, to read across generations, to read, obviously, as as I did growing up, to read in translation, to read weirdly, to read across genres, and to do so slowly with intent. I think, for me, it's something that I'm finding I benefit from, or I would like to do, and just to stop beating ourselves up for not, being caught up on everything, especially in this kind of flood of information that we're always getting.
So, still on the topic of consumption, do you think we can turn off this critical apparatus when it comes to mindless consumption? Because at the end of the day, you just wanna, when you're tired after work, you just wanna sit down, maybe watch a 30-minute show that will entertain you. So, what are your thoughts on like implications of mindless consumption?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I see a binary between mindless consumption or critical consumption. I don't. Well, I don't. I mean, I can speak for myself that I don't. I find that I can't really turn my brain off. I mean, I think I was just playing. Oh God, I was just playing Zelda Breath of the Wild. And at some point, I was just like, "Oh man, the Goron characters are very caricatural. This is a problem." I'm just trying to like get through the missions. So, speaking for myself personally, and probably speaking for Virgos as well, I do find it difficult to turn my brain off. And I mean, the truth of the matter is, I don't turn my brain off. But I think the fact that I don't turn my brain off doesn't then mean that I can't have pleasurable consumption, or that I can't consume content that may be problematic, or content that feels like, junky or junk food or anything like that. I don't have sort of boundaries between kind of highbrow or lowbrow. I mean, I have a partner who's very into rom-coms and romance, so I've watched a lot of bad romance reality TV shows on. Every bad romance reality TV show on Netflix you can imagine, I have watched it. And I've screamed, and I'm screaming about like the racial dynamics, the power dynamics, all of that. And I'm still watching it. I'm still eating popcorn. I'm still involved in it. So I think for me, I don't see a binary between it, because my critical side doesn't stop me from having pleasure in it. And if anything, I think that it would be helpful for us also to not think, because I think a lot of us do think that oh, if I criticize something, that will destroy the pleasure of it for me, and that's why I don't criticize it. And then we get into a cycle. Well, everything that I like has to be either morally good or neutral, and then, because that makes me feel morally good and neutral. And I don't really think that's a helpful way of thinking about the things we love, or it's ultimately all of the things that we're consuming are asking us to live in the same complexity that they live in, which is just the complexity of being in the world. Even if you're watching The Ultimatum on Netflix.
So basically, you have a commentary running whenever you're watching like rom-coms or.
Oh, I'm screaming. I'm actually screaming. Really screaming. This is why I can't go to movie theaters, because I've gotten used to just screaming at television screens.
I wonder what experience I would have if I watched something like Nailed It with you and you.
Oh my gosh,
Making...
I haven't got into Nailed It yet. I think the only cooking show I've watched is Great British Bake Off, because I lived in London. But even that, I was screaming. I can't watch. I cannot. I'm like the worst person to watch TV shows with.
Okay. Okay. What books, films, or music or art that changed the way you look at the world forever?
Oh, I mean, that would be difficult. I think that's difficult because I think like going back to what we were saying about phases. I think there was probably a book for every phase, I mean, obviously Greek myths changed my life forever, but then Autobiography of Red changed my life forever. But then, Star Trek changed my life forever. But then reading James Baldwin for the first time, reading Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, all of those, I think those are the various Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy, that definitely changed my life forever. Watching Wong Kar-wai's Happy Together changed my life forever. Watching Park Chan-wook's Sympathy for Lady Vengeance absolutely changed my life forever. I mean, I learned to play several Park Chan-wook themes on the piano because of this.
It's that level of. It's that
oh yeah,
level
listen
of,
to Virgo. I really mean it. So yeah, I think probably for every phase of for every lifetime that I've lived, there's been a book or an art piece that I can point to that era and go, yeah, during that era, that was the one.
Okay. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank
So
you.
we'll move on to the questions from the audience.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. I am told they are long questions, so we need to brace ourselves. Okay. I'm gonna read the ones flashing on the screen now.
Okay.
This is from K. Reynaldo. Thanks for your feisty, piercing work. How to Read Now reminds me of that 1980s Jameson essay on reading third world literature in the first world, in its emphasis on historical awareness. Your book attends to how colonial inheritances shape our reading practices. Could you speak more about how a nation figures in your critical apparatus, especially as a diasporic Filipino?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, I don't want to speak for all diasporic people, but I think certainly for me, I grew up. I mean, my dad used to say, I used to he used to call me. He said, "You're an American made of Filipino raw materials." That's what he used to say, and I
You
think
should
that
also
gave me.
put that on a shirt.
That's my new career pivot. I'm just gonna create merch. Just gonna create merch. But I think, which is also a very sci-fi line. It's a very synthetic line, and I think I did have an understanding of myself in some way as synthetic. And this is before reading Donna Haraway and Cyborg Manifesto or anything like that. But I think for me, I think a diasporic person understands. For me, I think I was very rooted in the place that I grew up in. That's for sure. I felt very rooted in Milpitas. I felt very rooted in the kind of California Bay Area I came out of because there was such a large Filipino community, and because of that, I never had this sense of, oh, I have to assimilate into American, which is the dog whistle word for white culture, because I wasn't American culture. This was America. Beverly Hills 90210, Baywatch, that was science fiction. I didn't, that was Mars as far as I was concerned. So in terms of the nation, I didn't experience the same, because I know, sort of fellow writers or friends or friends or people in my community who talk about a sort of sense of dislocation or feeling like, I think that they had to go back somewhere to understand their roots. And I think I was very defiant about that, being like, well, my roots are in the strip malls of the Bay Area. And there's the fact that my Tagalog is very broken, my Pangasinan, even more so, despite the fact that it was my first language, and Ilocano, forget about it. That none of those things make me lesser than, that all of those things contribute to my wholeness, and that I always often think about how much privilege it also requires in order to quote unquote keep it real. Every Filipino that I knew in Milpitas or in the Bay Area who was able to go back to the Philippines regularly or who spoke Tagalog fluently, they were all upper middle class. They were all people who had their little condo in Makati, and who were like, and it was like that avenue just was not open to us. But in that way, authenticity becomes something that is class inflected ultimately, because those people were allowed to say, oh, well, I'm still, I'm more Filipino than you, or I'm more authentic than you. And it becomes a way of saying, well, the wealthy have the right to maintain their links, and the poor, who had to flee for political reasons or economic reasons, don't. So that's always been my kind of fraught relationship to the ideas of authenticity or nation. But I mean, on the other hand, I think I also have, just an enormous tenderness and love. The word is love for the places where my parents came from. And I've only been to the Philippines 3 times, and the first time my father kidnapped me, which is a plot point in America Is Not the Heart, for people who have read that book. So there's this whole sliding doors other life that I could have lived had he not had a change of heart and realized that was maybe a morally thing to do, and brought me back to California. And then the second time was shortly before America's Not the Heart came out. And then the third time was when I met Don and Honey. And that was the first time I came to Manila without my family. So it's the first time I came as an adult working, and not, you don't land in the airport in Manila and then immediately, have to go off to the provinces.
Yeah.
That was my experience. So the first time I was like, oh wow, I'm like going out in Cubao. It's like, ooh,
The
like,
adult version of going to Manila.
Exactly. I was like, oh, hipster Manila. And I remember, I think I was talking to Christina, a Muslim, and she was like, because she's from Mindanao also, or she's from the South. And she was like, yeah, Manila's an imperial city. And I loved it. I was like, yes, that's what but I think that was my first time having this kind of this joyful adult experience in the Philippines. And that trip remains formative and is a treasure for me. So I think in that sense, I think that also gave me a new lease on thinking about the Philippines. I mean, obviously, I come to thinking about it with a lot of humility, because I'm aware that I think there's there are just in the most sort of basic material way, there are just fundamental material differences between our experiences. But I also, I just find myself always, when I read people's commentary about the book and it's in Tagalog, I have to say those are the commentaries that actually really mean the most to me. When I hear when someone sends me something and it's like, I don't know, there was someone sent me a tweet and it's like, what is it? Bawat page, something like every page had a highlight or something. I was like, oh, you could say this to me in English, but the fact that it's in Tagalog, that actually means something to me. So there's that as well. But I mean, obviously, we can also get into the kind of debates around Filipino and Filipinx as well, but that will also be here all day. So
We will do that later. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This is from, sorry if I mispronounce your name, Reggie Digia. Hi Elaine, I've been a fan since I heard you talking at the Philippine Literary Festival.
oh.
I love how insistent you are in locating yourself as an American and Filipino American. This is just a Virgo in her. The awareness that being in a universalized culture and place doesn't make your words universal. I think more first world authors should locate themselves instead of having third world authors universalize. As such, I'd like to ask if this self awareness has been a challenge in publishing this book. America is not the heart and prior experiences.
That's a really good question. That's a really astute way of putting it, and I completely agree. I think that's one of the critiques that I level at the, like the cliches that reading should teach us empathy, which ultimately, in the most practical sense, is asking writers of color to provide. I mean, ultimately, what that type of reading discourse or literary discourse produces is that writers of color or third world authors are supposed to produce work that educates, consoles, has glossaries, etc., talks about their identity politics, and we white writers are just universal, and we don't understand their works through the rubric of identity politics. I mean, Wes Anderson's movies are very specific identity politics. That is a very specific white milieu that he is talking about. So, and the same with Peter Handke. Peter Handke is very specific white identity politics, and yet we don't use this, we don't deploy the same vocabulary to talk about those authors, because those authors within a mainstream literary discourse are just understood as universal, understood as neutral. And I agree. The impulse for writers of color to then assimilate into that way of thinking, I think, is something that impoverishes all of our writing. It's something, I mean, I think I talk about it a little bit in one of the penultimate essay, Autobiography in Asian Film, which talks about how much I don't like positive representation, or what we might call representation matters art, which is critiquing essentially this push, the pull of writers of color to produce positive representation, or essentially to produce art that caters to that gaze, caters to that universalizing gaze. I'm not interested. I'm just not interested in that, because it just doesn't seem to be about people. Art like that is not about people. Art that's about people is about the specific, about the absolutely granular specific, and that includes the political, that includes the material, that includes the emotional and the sensual and the erotic. And so I think for me, this is just a very long way of saying that I agree with you, which is that I don't think it serves us to bow down to this universalizing impulse. If anything, it would serve our literary and intellectual culture to be more specific, to be more granular, and to read that way. Because I think actually a lot of white authors, authors that are, George Eliot is very aware that she's writing about a very specific milieu. Jane Austen is also very aware she's writing about a specific milieu. It's how that they are read by the kind of engines of literary discourse, by English majors or English institutions or academic institutions. It's how they are then taught. That's, I think, for example, going back to being a classics nerd, like a lot of the kind of 18th and 19th century literature and archaeological kind of research around the classics around that time, done by mainly German and English archaeologists and classicists, was really one that was just like obsessed about the white statues and how they reveal these kind of core rationality about Western civilization, and all of it is sort of building towards essentially a kind of confirmation bias about white rationality and white civilization. But all of the forensic data has shown us is that all of these Greek temples, all of those religious sites, all of the kind of ancient classical sites, none of them were white. They were painted riot of colors. They were extremely colorful, and they've just faded to white over time. So what viewpoint on history is that reproducing by continuing to reproduce this lie? And I think the decolonizing impulse in classics, I think, is one good example of how certain forms of reading produce certain ways of living and believing about believing things about the world.
This is from Jen Eusebio. Hi, Elaine. Thank you so much for being with us in this discussion. Just one question from me. What do you think is the role of the reader in the process of passing down collective memory? Particularly in the case of fraught history from one generation to the next.
Oh gosh, I think about this often. I think the essay I think that goes into this the most is probably the last essay,
Yeah.
The Children of Polyphemus, which goes from talking about the classics and specifically, well, it goes from talking about Cinderella and the colonial era writer who wrote the version of Cinderella that has a pumpkin in it, which actually is from a piece that I read for the first time at the Philippine International Literary Festival. So that's a shout out to you guys. And then goes into talking about a colonial era translation of the Odyssey. And so ultimately what that critique is not so much a critique of the Odyssey itself, but the critique of the way the Odyssey has been passed down through generations by the people who read what they wanted to read in it, and then passed down a vision of the world that they wanted other people to read in it. And in the case of this particular translator, that vision of the world does reflect a colonial mindset. It does reflect a way of thinking about the self, or the rational Western self, as embodied by Odysseus, and the other who, the foreign other, the strange other, the monstrous other, whose life can be invaded and stripped for parts. I think about that in how we tell stories, in how memory is passed down, and how much collective historical amnesia is also passed down in what we might call, or what I call in the essays, these willful misreadings, these willful it's not hard to draw a parallel to the ways, we're trying to, here in the States, certainly trying to, just essentially not teach our history, how the amounts of schools that are not teaching, that are agitating against teaching the history of slavery in America, the history of the Confederacy in America, because of this, this radical political agenda, because it is a radical political agenda to teach a specific side of history as told by its victors, as told by, a particular social, racial, and class. So that's what's at stake when we think about our reading practices and what we pass down and how we read each other, and the kinds of stories we're able to tell each other because of what we read. So it's something that I think about. Even on a personal sense, I think about, obviously as a diasporic person, one's relationship to the ancestral, or one's relationship to indigeneity, is very fraught, because there are just fundamentally some things I will never know. But I've been thinking recently about, there's this lullaby that my mom used to sing to me growing up. And it's not in Pangasinan. It's not in Ilocano. Obviously, it's not in Tagalog, because she wouldn't sing to me in Tagalog. And it is in a language because it has a grammatical structure. It was something her mom sang to her, and her mom's mom sang to her. She doesn't know what language it is. She just knows it. And I can sing it off by heart, and I don't know what language it is. And if I were to, conjecture, then yeah, maybe if I did research about various indigenous languages in Luzon, I might be able to find it. But there's also something, I think there's also something precious to me in the having of it, and then maybe the not knowing, even though obviously there's some part of me that would love to know. But I think I'm also aware that reparative justice is hard and long, and I also have to make a life with gaps, and I think a lot of us have to learn that. Although we fight every day. Hi, my love. Oh, my dog's coming. She's hearing me get serious. So I think those are the conflicting feelings about collective memory, and the possibilities of them and the impossibilities of them.
We'll have two more questions. This is from Andrea Pinaligan. Hi, Andrea. Hi, Elaine and Don. How do you approach loving the work of problematic artists?
I think going back to what we were saying earlier about living in the complexity of things, I also think it's not because I continue to read an artist that I know is sexist or has racist depictions in his work that I exonerate myself by thinking, oh, I'm reading him in spite of that, or I love him despite that. I think I have to accept and implicate myself that when I read Philip Roth or when I read George Eliot or Coetzee, that I'm reading with, that all of those things are included in that, and that I'm implicated in the sense that I can't just think, well, oh, I don't like sexism, but besides that, I really love his language. I think it's also an opportunity for me to sit inside places of internalized misogyny in me, sit inside complex, fraught, ugly places. Art is not just there. This is the thing that I that I talk about in one of the early essays. But obviously, art's not supposed to make us comfortable. That argument is very basic because the people who say that kind of stuff are the kind of usually white artists who want to be free to transgress but don't want to have their critics free to critique them. So that's not something I'm interested in. I think I'm interested in complexity. But I also think the same way that I say that, the same way that I'm talking about that your life makes you the kind of reader you are, I also think your life makes you or gives you the problematic artists that are yours alone. Yours might not be the same as mine, and vice versa. And I think the artists that remain for you tell you things about yourself, and I think it's worth looking at that. I don't think it serves us to turn away from it.
Okay. And for the last question, this is from Daniel Lorenzo Pineda. Hi Elaine, thank you for this interview and for your books. Enjoyed America is Not the Heart a lot. What is it like writing how to read now versus writing America is Not the Heart? Again, thank you.
I think, someone was asking me if I think, is it easier to write a second book now that you've already written a first? And I just said no. No, because it feels like every book that you write has taught you to how to write that book. But just to say, I know how to write, America's Not the Heart. When I started this book, I don't know how to write this. So now I know how to write this book. But working on the novel that I'm working on now, I'm teaching myself how to write that book. So in that sense, it's not that it's easier, although I will say I do think I find there's something that I don't think easier is quite the word, but there is and this is probably just a Virgo thing, but it doesn't. Essays are just ultimately being combative, and as a Virgo, as an earth sign, my love language is nonstop criticism. So it's a mode that comes, I think, more natural to me, whereas I think fiction writing asks me to do more, or to stand outside of that that facility a bit more. So there's that. There were some points when I was working on the essays where I was like, oh, I should just do this and I'll just complain all day. That'd be great.
Okay, so that's the last question from the audience. As much as we want to talk to Elaine for the entire day, that's about our time. So thank you, Elaine, again for joining us today.
No, thank you, Don. Thank you for the amazing interview, and thank you to everyone for your wonderful questions. This has been truly one of the best interviews, that I've done. So don't tell anyone here.
So for those who are watching, thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to get a copy of How to Read Now from fullybookonline.com or your nearest Fully Book branch. This is the book, so if you see it on the shelves, grab it right away. So thanks again, everyone, and take care. Bye.
Thank you. Salamat.